Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Tim Zakaria. I'm excited to be presenting a follow-up training here for you today focused on assessment data in Read 180, really digging into the student application to monitor student learning to track progress in the instructional software. I'd like to briefly review our learning outcomes for today and our agenda, and then we'll get right into it. So after this training, we're going to be able to review all the assessment options and reporting in Read 180 Universal. We'll look at the major assessments to monitor student progress, briefly reviewing data in each rotation, and hopefully kind of discuss about the different assessment options so you all can come up with a plan moving forward. We'll look at sample student application data. That's going to be the big focus here today, discussing major goals for performance and student application completion. A bulk of the time will be spent reviewing that application report for sure. We'll talk a little bit about placement and leveling in Read 180 Universal and criteria for success. Always something to really look at is the placement with your students as they're making progress. We'll talk about common challenges in the student application. We definitely have some strategies, tips, and resources to help facilitate student success. We'll briefly introduce student application data to look at targeting instruction as well. When they get into the application, we're going to get some really good skills-based data to look at supplementing and providing additional support on skills we might be struggling. And then we'll look at practical resources to conference, set goals, and provide some accountability to make sure students are making progress. We do have a very packed training, a lot of good stuff here for you. We'll start out with just an introduction to data and reporting. Again, a lot of the time we'll spend looking at that application data, the student app report, really digging into that. And then we'll talk at the end, we'll kind of wrap it up all together, come up with a plan for giving feedback, conferencing, and looking for some more practical resources in the program to use with our students. So one question, couple questions to kind of to keep in mind and just to ask yourself as we go. How can you use the data to monitor the progress of your students? And then how can we actually put this to use to inform instruction, to make educational decisions with our students? And we have a lot of different options for assessment, both to monitor progress, but also to really inform grouping, planning, pacing, maybe reteaching with your students as well. So just some guiding questions to keep in mind here as you're digging into your reports. Briefly, we'll talk about the instructional model here as well. So as our overall progress monitor, we're going to start out talking about reading inventory. This, of course, is going to be our assessment to look at to placing our students, to getting a baseline, and then our progress monitor after that. And then each rotation, we're briefly going to review the data for the application, independent reading, and then also whole and small group, key reports in each one of those as well. But let's start off by talking about reading inventory, phonics inventory. Reading inventory is going to be our progress monitoring assessment. This is going to assess our students' comprehension. And the way that this test works is if they've never logged into reading inventory before, they're going to get a different passage, a grade level passage. They're going to read that passage and then answer a fill in the blank close type question to get at the main idea of that passage. If they get that question right, the next passage gets a little bit harder. If they get it wrong, the next passage gets a little bit easier. They're going to answer about 20 to 25 questions, 20 to 25 minutes or so to take this assessment. When they're finished, it's always continuously adapting to their level, and they're going to get a Lexile after the test. They're actually going to see that Lexile on the screen. With reading inventory, we do recommend giving this test 3 to 5 times per year, at least 8 weeks apart between tests to really allow students to grow and develop as readers. So we're measuring the response to the intervention that we're giving, and we're actually measuring the growth versus maybe just a little bit of variability. So kind of keep that in mind. We do want to space out those tests to account to give students the chance to develop those skills as readers. In terms of identifying students for Read 180, placing in our programs, the way that we recommend the placement is if you're teaching secondary education, grades 6 through 12, above 600 Lexile, those students can fit into Read 180 Universal. Above 400 Lexile, we're going to place at the elementary level, we're also going to place our students in Read 180. So typically we do recommend RI for all students as an initial assessment. And then just that group below 600, below 400, we're going to provide additional assessment, additional screening with the phonics inventory to determine if we need to go into system 44 at that point. And we're going to look at that assessment and those scores here very shortly. Once you've administered the reading inventory, there's several reports you could use to obtain scores. The Lexile Proficiency and Growth Report in HMH Teacher Central. There's a lot of reports in SAM. The Growth Report or the Growth Goals Report you could certainly use to get Lexiles as well. That's going to give you your Lexile score. It's going to show you your students' performance bands as well. Are they below basic, basic, proficient, or advanced? Let's talk about the performance bands here real quick. So proficiency levels on your performance bands align with year-end expectations. So we do have some fall placement recommendations as well. And if we give reading inventory to a student and we see green for proficient, that's indicating that they're reading at a Lexile level consistent with year expectations, year-end expectations for their grade. So if we're a 7th grader and we test 1,000 Lexile, then we're determined proficient as far as the year end of our grade level. The Lexile is really just a measure of text complexity. How complex is that passage? How long are the sentences? How frequent are the words in that passage? And the more complex the text, the higher our Lexile for our students. Those proficiency bands do align with common core expectations for what we want to be seeing our students read at each grade level. The eligibility chart in the bottom right, you see, so that middle column, that eligible for Read 180 column, that's kind of the ideal candidates for Read 180, 600 to grade level, about 1,000 or so in the secondary, or 400 to about 700 in elementary. Automatically, we're going to place within Read 180. Below that, BR, which is beginning reader, like a 0 Lexile to 600, we want to give phonics inventory to determine if Tier 3 intervention system 44 is a little bit more appropriate. Let's look at the phonics inventory. So this test is a little bit quicker, 5 to 10 minutes to take this assessment. It's going to look at decoding ability. There's 3 parts of this test. Everything is read to your students. So if you do give this to your students in class, they should probably have a headset because it's all going to be audio prompting for them. They're going to be assessed on letter recognition, sight words, and nonsense words. There'll be 4 different options come up on the screen, maybe 4 sight words. They'll be read the correct sight word. They have to be accurate, and they have to be fluent. So they do have to get that word in the correct amount of time. They have to respond quick enough. It's a big part of the test. We're looking to see if they're fluent decoders or if they really need a little bit more instruction and practice to become automatic fluent readers. After phonics inventory, we can run that phonics proficiency and growth report that you'll find in Teacher Central. And students will get a fluency score. This is a number 0 to 60. And really the most important thing to look at is the decoding status. So above 23 is advancing decoder. We rule out the need for instruction in System 44 at that point. Below that score, we might identify a student as a pre-decoder, beginning decoder, or developing decoder. These are students now we've just identified a need for more Tier 3 intensive intervention in System 44. So below 600 lexile and pre-beginning or developing decoder, these are good candidates for System 44. Next, I want to review a little bit of guidance provided by DODEA headquarters for strategic literacy intervention. So this information does come right from DODEA headquarters. And so the SLI goal to remediate identified academic skill deficits so students can successfully meet the literacy demands of their grade level instruction. That SLI is critical supplemental instruction. And in terms of reading inventory, that should only be available to those students enrolled in that Read 180 strategic literacy course. Reading inventory is a really good measure to think about identifying students' individual needs and identifying students for that intervention program. However, multiple sources of data should really be considered to confidently determine that need for enrollment, monitoring progress, and the capacity to exit. We certainly do always encourage multiple data sources, multiple measures when we're making those placement and exiting decisions. And reading inventory can certainly provide good data to support that. So which students qualify to receive strategic literacy instruction in Read 180? Research indicates that approximately 5 to 15% of students may have below grade level performance or slower than expected rates of growth, despite quality core instruction and differentiation. These are the students who may need referral to strategic literacy instruction for more targeted reading skills instruction in Read 180. So based on the recommendation of the designated school-based team who meet regularly to review multiple sources of student data, both summative and formative, to problem solve and identify targeted classroom-based strategies for students who are not making expected progress, and to make collective decisions about placement for students needing that strategic instruction. Okay. So to wrap it up, in terms of using the reading inventory and phonics inventory to identify students and place students in program, we do have a brief handout to kind of sum up the different data points in reading inventory and phonics inventory to use when looking at identifying students. So this handout will be with your course materials, and I've included the placement chart. I've referenced the reports that we can run to obtain those scores. And again, on that chart, that middle column, good candidates for Read 180. The left column, we're going to give phonics inventory below 600, below 400 to those students. And again, which students we can identify for instruction, more targeted instruction in more intensive instruction in System 44. And again, advancing decoder, we generally rule out the need for System 44. Those two assessments together, we can use to identify students, we can use as our progress monitors. Once we have them placed in programs, Read 180 or System 44, then we also want to look at data in each aspect of the instructional model. So we really want to look at how are students demonstrating mastery in the application, independent reading, whole and small group. The bulk of this training, again, we're going to focus on that student application data, but a few other core concepts that we do want to review before we look at some sample data here. So the instructional levels in the student app, this is a very foundational idea to the program and definitely something to be familiar with. These application reading levels, the way it works is when your student takes reading inventory, they're going to be placed at an instructional level the first time they log in based on that most recent reading inventory score. Within that level, they're going to be reading at a Lexile range. So you can see for level 4, for example, we're going to be reading at a 750 to about a 900 or so. That range is going to correspond with what the Lexile level of the text that students will get in reading zone. That's really one of the critical zones in the program, is that reading zone. That's where they're getting their leveled passage, and they'll answer core comprehension questions within their instructional level. If you're a level 1, it's a very different experience than, say, if you're a level 6. And not only in terms of the text that you'll be reading, but the spelling words will be different. The level of scaffolding will be different for a level 1 versus a level 6. In some cases, the questioning and the activities altogether are very different. So it's always worth kind of considering those levels when you're looking at your students' data. If your students are struggling, we can decrease the instructional level. If they're showing growth and they're making improvement and they're showing growth on reading inventory, we can update that instructional level as well. And so we'll kind of come back to that when we look at the report. As a quick overview of the data from the application, our focus today will be Read 180, but I put up a comparison here. System 44 will give you really similar data. And when we get our students into the application, we're going to get continuous assessment data. Both software programs will give time on task, sessions, minutes, both areas we can look at setting a goal with students. If we're in Read 180, we want to see students completing zones and segments, and we'll talk more about that here shortly. System 44, the software is organized a little bit different. When you run those reports, you'll see, are they completing topics and series? Again, all areas we can set a goal with our students. We're also going to get performance scores. Student application, the skills are mostly focused on language, comprehension, and spelling. And we'll get some data to look at targeting reading comprehension skills, key idea detail, inferencing. In System 44, performance scores are mostly for decoding and fluency, but also comprehension and spelling. And data can also support providing targeted instruction in the foundations as well for that program. Both instructional softwares can be used for writing or fluency assessment. Students will complete both writing and recordings in both softwares, and we can use those to assess both their writing skills and fluency with rubrics through those different software submissions. Again, we're going to dig into the application data here pretty soon. So a quick overview and just in terms of the type of assessment data that we'll get from the software. But let's talk about independent reading. There's a lot of formative assessment options. And for independent reading, we always recommend adding in some accountability, some procedures, and some expectations in that rotation to ensure that students are being successful. In your HMH Teacher Central resources, there's reading logs, daily reading logs. We can complete a brief summary every day on what we've read. Every text in the library for Read 180 and System 44, every book has quick writes, graphic organizers, and a quiz. Quizzes and independent reading will give you the bulk of your data, and we'll look at the independent reading report here in just a minute. But another thing that we're going to talk more about a little bit later as well, just kind of checking in and conferencing with students as well, giving them feedback on their performance, and maybe talking about setting a goal or holding them accountable to check their level of understanding and if they're meeting that criteria for success as well in that rotation. When your students pass or take a quiz or pass a quiz in their independent reading bookshelf, we're going to have the independent reading report that will give you all the quiz scores. It'll show you passed and failed quizzes. If you fail a quiz, by default, you'll just have to wait a day, but you can retake that again any number of times until you get that, until you pass that quiz. When you pass a quiz, you're going to get that score. The students will see that score, so they're going to know if they passed or not. And then your independent reading report will total up the words read and the points read from those books. Students also see that measure on their bookshelf. So when they log in to access those digital titles, they'll see their Lexile at the top of the screen, the books they've read, the words they've read, and the points they've read. Those are the major data points. So for independent reading, something to think about would be using the data from this report to set a goal or potentially provide some type of incentive with your students. So, for example, we could set a goal for maybe number of books read throughout the semester, or maybe number of points throughout the semester. Or we could maybe have a class goal for total words read. And maybe the highest class, the highest number of words read could earn some type of incentive. So independent reading report and the student application report, there's some good data points to think about providing a goal for students or some type of incentive that they can work to. And it would be really easy to update to. We could run the independent reading report on a daily or weekly basis and update that progress for the class. For whole and small group instruction, so moving along now, that's that independent reading report, key report for that rotation. For whole and small group, there's a lot of assessment options, but what we're gonna do is just focus on the main assessment that you'll get with RealBook, which is called the workshop assessment. In each workshop, there's 2 workshop assessments. There's an interim and end of workshop after parts 1 and parts 2 of each workshop. These assessments we can assign online, or you can print them out. If you assign them digitally, it will score it for you, and you'll get a report outlining your students' performance according to the same skills and standards that they've learned throughout each workshop. It's going to assess comprehension, language, and the end of workshop assessment will also assess writing. The end of workshop's a little bit longer. And essentially what we can do is, after we've given these assessments, we can use that data to look at targeted lessons in maybe reading, writing, or language. There's a lot of supplemental lessons in your resources for differentiated instruction. And if we were to give this assessment and realize that a lot of our students are struggling with maybe summarizing or prefixes, central idea, detail, we can pause. Maybe at a checkpoint day, we can pause for a few days and pull some targeted lessons for some reteach based on that workshop assessment. This slide shows an overview of a workshop, and they're all laid out in a very similar sequence. And this is in your printed teacher's edition, your blended learning handbook. It shows you where and when to assign that interim and that end of workshop assessment. And if you haven't given this, we would tend to recommend assigning that end of workshop assessment just to see how our students are doing. It is kind of a difficult, it is a fairly difficult test, but it is also leveled. You can assign a below grade level test if you want to see if our students are learning those same skills and standards from whole and small group. The key report for your workshop assessments is the workshop assessment report. Also in your data dashboard, HMH Teacher Central. This will give you overall grades, but it'll also give you skills-based data for each of your students. So we can see that target strategy in the top right, citing evidence might be a skill we want to think about reteaching. And again, if we look down at student performance data, you'll get a score within each skill that we've taught in the workshop. This is our overall class level report. There's also a student level workshop assessment report where, again, we'll get the score. We can see level A is below grade level. You can give this on grade level as well. And then again, for each student, we can do that skills assessment, see how they're doing on each of those skills, what are the standards, and then good data to think about pulling some supplemental resources to help target some of those areas where we might need a little bit more support. That is a really quick overview of the different assessment areas. Each rotation, again, has some data, has a report tied to it, and then our RIPI as our overall progress monitor in the program. So what I'd like to do is we're just going to pause right there. And if you want to take a minute just to kind of jot down some notes and just think through, what is your overall assessment plan? What data will you regularly review and how often? What data will you consider using to conference with your students? All of these reports could provide some valuable data to monitor progress, but also to give some feedback to your students. Something we're going to revisit when we come back to our student application data here very briefly. So we'll take a quick pause right there, and then we'll move forward into the student application. Okay, moving right along. So I'd like to take a deep dive into the Read 180 student application report and really dig into the data here so we can look and make sure our students are being active, completing work, and showing progress in the student application. So we're going to bring up HMH Teacher Central. All of your data and reports, of course, is going to be found in your data dashboard. All those reports we mentioned before, your Lexiles, your phonics proficiency scores, System 44 reports, independent reading, workshop assessment, of course, as well. And so what we're going to do is click down to our Read 180 student application. At the top of this report, we have kind of an overview summary of completion, so sessions, minutes, and segments. And we're certainly going to talk more about this here. But this is a class averages. We should see a grid here, which gives an overview average of minutes spent in the instructional software. And if we go down to the bottom of the page, we should have our students right here. And then all four of these tabs, we can kind of click through and we'll get different information for our students. So I'd like to start on the overview. We can see our students, we can see that instructional level as well. We have students' most recent Lexile score. Remember, they're going to be given an instructional level based on their initial reading inventory assessment. We can see when they started. Segment completion, words read. This column is actually pulling data from the independent reading report. This words read is not going to be in the student application. It's data from passing your independent reading quizzes and then Lexile growth. So what I'd like to share at this point is if we're looking at our students, one of those best practices in the program is to go back and assess those instructional levels after each reading inventory assessment. So if we bring up this after we've maybe given our mid-year December reading inventory test, and we can see here students that have shown a lot of growth. It's always worth looking at those instructional levels. So we'll give you this handout in your training resources here. But if we were to have this resource and use this as a reference to look at our students who may have shown some progress on that most recent reading inventory, Theo here, for example, Theo's a level 4, scored a 1500. If we look at our instructional levels, 1500 is actually off the charts, right? So that student is exceeding the level of instruction in the Read 180 student application. So we can use this to kind of make a quick comparison. Not everyone's going to show that level of growth, of course, but maybe we're a level 1 student like Sean, 560 Lexile. Maybe he showed some growth and he's actually at a 700 Lexile. In that case, if he took reading inventory and entered the software based on that most recent score, he'd be at a level 3. So you can always look at updating those levels based on that most recent reading inventory test if you want to. Students can level up based on their progress in the software, but it's very difficult. It's a very high level of success that they need to show across multiple segments. More likely, you're going to have to go in and up that level based on that test. This student, Theo here, again, reading at a very high level, probably would be a good candidate to exit the program. If you do want to change levels at any time, those settings can be found in your class management. Just by clicking on one of your students' last names and then navigating to your product settings button and clicking the little edit icon. That'll allow you to change the instructional level. Let your student know too, because it'll be very different. It might be more challenging for them as well. The next time they complete or enter a segment, it'll be at a whole new level. Let's go back to our data dashboard and let's go back to our student application report. Session length, we can see segments. We're going to have a little bit more detailed information on time on task if we click over to implementation. So let's click over to that tab. Now, when your students enter the student application, they've just started a session. In order to make sure that you're capturing your progress, capturing the performance in the Read 180 student application, you always want to just make sure to let them know to log out with the little X, or if there's a log out icon, there's always going to be a way within the screen where they're going to be able to log out. That's going to make sure that they capture that data, capture all the minutes, and it saves their work. If they just close the browser tab down or shut the computer down without logging out or clicking the little X in the top right corner of the screen, it may not capture all of their performance data. So definitely let them know about that. That's going to be a session. It's going to track the minutes. The minutes in Read 180, however, are not going to be active time. So this is minute that's going to track regardless of whether they're actually completing work in the application. For example, they might log on, maybe they navigate to another website or they get up to go get a drink of water. They're still going to track minutes. So that's when we want to start looking at, are they being active? Are we completing segments? Are we showing performance scores in our zone scores as well? And we'll have some strategies to make sure that our students are being active and making progress here. So if we click back over to implementation, the whole goal in Read 180 is to complete a segment. And to understand what a segment is, I'd like to reference another one of your handouts. These pages are taken from our professional learning guide, our training manual. And it gives a pretty good overview of the application and shows you exactly what your students are seeing. So once they log in through Student Central, they're going to work through segments. And a segment is essentially a different topic. For example, Gustavo or maybe Malala, Standing Tall. These are all segments that they can choose once they've completed the Mindset Matters segment, which they all start with a little bit of growth mindset instruction. They're going to work mostly in order through those 6 zones. They do have a little bit of freedom to choose and jump around in your reading and language and fluency zone, but they do need to work mostly in order through those 6 zones. At the end, once they've done success, they're going to get and they've submitted their final recording to you, they're going to get a congratulations screen. You've just completed a segment, and that's a huge accomplishment. That is the big goal in the program. And what we tend to see in the data is that the students that complete more segments tend to show more growth in terms of Lexile. Throughout the 6 zones, we're going to do language, vocabulary in the Explore and language, reading comprehension. Fluency is going to be word reading and spelling. Writing, of course, once per segment, you'll get that writing in your teacher tools assignment board. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. Success is comprehension and a final recording. They do a lot of recording in the application. You'll have access to the writing and the final recording from success. This handout gives you a really good overview of what those different zones are assessing. And we'll talk more about these here as well. But if you want to see exactly what the students are seeing, this handout breaks down each activity, shows you the skills and the instructional purpose, and can really help troubleshoot too if any kind of questions come up with your students. So that's a segment. A journey through those 6 zones is a segment. And as I mentioned, students in the application, they're going to be tracking time. But we want to make sure that they're tracking time and being active and actually completing work and completing segments. That's when the program does have a little bit of guidance on how long it takes to do a segment. So the official guidance is 5 to 15 sessions per segment. Now, that's given that we have about a 15 to 20 minute session. So we like to see about 2 to 3 sessions per week. We might be doing it every other day, or we might be doing it daily. But 2 to 3 sessions per week on average for about 15 to 20 minutes. If we're doing about 15 to 20 minutes a session, then we're going to be doing about 5 to 15 sessions per segment. And it is a pretty big range because our students are at a different level. It's certainly individual, and students are going to move at a varying paces through the software. 5 to 15 sessions per segment. We can also look at that in terms of minutes. So if we're doing 5 to 15 sessions per segment with about a 15 to 20 minute session, if we take an average, well, we tend to see about 10 sessions per segment. That would be about 150 to 200 minutes per segment. You might see students doing down to as low as, say, 100 minutes per segment, which is a little bit on the faster side. If we bring up this report and see students up to about 300-400 minutes, anything really over 300 minutes, and we haven't done a segment, that might be a student we might want to conference with, check in, and make sure that they're being active and engaged with the software. So we can see from here, based on those numbers, Sean here, we're up to almost 400 minutes. We haven't done a segment. Might want to check in with him. Theo has done 3 segments in less than 300 minutes. So he's moving at a very quick pace. Luis probably moving at a pretty average pace. Tiffany, pretty average as well. And most students are making pretty good progress. We have one student we might want to check in with, and Theo here we might want to look at as well and see and look at his scores and maybe think about is he being successful as well, and is he being challenged? So we can certainly revisit that student. Let's click over to our performance scores. So again, in your PLG handout, it's a really good reference if you want to know what that activity looks like in your zones. You can also click about this table and it shows you a description of what each activity is. So Explore Zone is going to be vocabulary assessment on 6 different power words that students are going to learn before their reading passage. So it's going to look for things like definitions, word parts, synonyms, antonyms, word usage. Explore and language are both going to be vocabulary assessment, building background knowledge for that reading. Reading zone is a very key zone. This is where students, after they've viewed the anchor video, they've done some vocabulary instruction. They're gonna look at that leveled passage for the first time. They're gonna have to record themselves reading it. They might have to listen to that passage once as well. And then they're gonna answer several different core comprehension questions on that passage. Summarize, compare, contrast, sequencing, imprinting. Reading zone is a very interactive questions as well. Multiple question parts, maybe a part A and a part B. Reading zone is a very challenging, and we'll bring up our handout here just so we can see a little bit of a snapshot, but it is a very challenging zone. It is where we do tend to see some of the lower scores. And if you're conferencing and giving some feedback to students, it's definitely worth emphasizing reading zone, because it is a challenge area in the program. We're also going to get some skills-based data from reading zone. So we definitely want our students doing their best. If they're being really successful in reading zone at their instructional level, that's excellent. That's really what we'd like to see. Word assessment and spelling assessment both come from the fluency zone. And word assessment is word reading. They'll have a list of 6 different words. It'll read them the correct word, and they have to select the correct word. Spelling is another one of the challenge areas in the program. So the spelling assessment, the data and the score that you see here, this spelling assessment is kind of like a pre-test. When you first go into the spelling area, you're going to get that spelling assessment, and you'll be given a list of words. And if you miss words on that spelling assessment, if you have a low score here, those words are going to be moved over to your spelling, your study words, and you're going to have to drill on those words and eventually show mastery. So for students who do struggle with spelling, we'll have a few kind of tips and strategies to support those students a little bit later, but definitely worth looking at those assessment scores. And again, if they do have a lower score there, likely they have more study words, and likely they might take a little bit longer to complete that spelling component. Success zone, this is going to be a comprehension measure at the end of the segment. Once they've practiced with that passage, they've done the vocabulary, they've done the writing, the spelling. Success is like a final comprehension task. It's going to be a little bit different depending on your levels. And that's it. Again, once they've done that, they've done a segment. One other thought that you could do here as well, if you're looking at kind of tracking and making sure and seeing what students are doing maybe on a daily or a weekly basis, you can always come up to the top of your report, change the dates. If you wanted to change and select maybe a week's worth of data or even a day's worth of data, you could apply that. And when you come down to your report, it's only going to give you scores logged from those dates. So if there's a question about what exactly that student accomplished during that date, if you isolate that date range, you'll see those scores and that activity from just that day. Now, we can even get a little bit more in depth here with our student progress and our student scores. But one other thing I want to make sure I mention is the attempt icon here as well. So this, you can choose either first or second attempt. Now, not every zone has a second attempt necessarily. Explore Reading and Language will have a second attempt, and Success may have a second attempt depending on your instructional level. But anyways, the way it works is we'll take Reading Zone, for example. If we're reading that passage, maybe we're answering a key idea detail question. If we get that wrong, what the program will do is it'll highlight the relevant section of the passage. It'll kind of show them where to find the answer, maybe give them a clue to the evidence that they need. They get another shot. If they get it right, the score will go up. So it'll never go down, and it may go up on that second attempt. So something to keep in mind while you're looking at your student scores. The daily report, this will give you a record of the minutes from each day spent in the software. And we can see here if they've logged in and completed a session on that day, they're gonna track those minutes right here. So it could be a good resource if you have students using at home and just want to make sure that they logged in for that day. Okay, so now we can also view data for each student, and we'll get a little bit more information. So what I'd like to do is we're going to click back to our performance tab, and we're going to look at Theo here. And all we have to do is just click that student's name, and you can do that on any one of your reports. If you just click on your student name, you'll bring up the student level report, and now we're looking at information for just Theo. Again, by default, you should have year-to-date data, but you can always change those dates to isolate a specific range and look at scores, segments completed just within that time frame. You should also be able to go back to prior year data if you had students for multiple years. So we can see the student current level 4. We know based on our discussion before, we're already considering leveling him up based on his reading inventory growth, 3 segments, 18 minutes. And I have this chart here, zone performance overall. I have an average and a current segment. I can even look at second attempt for those as well. And some things that are always kind of nice to see. We have the average and the current segment. It's nice to see the current higher than the average, especially if we come down and we look through our different tabs, and we'll have more detailed in each zone here. If we see scores trending up in reading zone at their instructional level, or the current segment higher than the average, that's excellent. That student is showing some improvement. And again, that reading zone, always a good zone to get feedback and maybe set a goal for growth with your students. So we'd like to see the current higher than the average, so we're making progress, maybe scores trending up. If we bring up this report and maybe we see that reading zone is a little bit lower, but at the end of the segment, the student has improved with success. This is also a comprehension measure here. So even if we've struggled a little bit with success, it's nice to see some improvement. Even if we've struggled a little bit with reading zone, it's nice to see improvement with success as well. That means that student has started to really understand the passage after really drilling through it a few times, doing the vocabulary and the spelling and that kind of thing. So let's come down here. Overall, this student is showing some fairly high scores. Reading zone, if we see higher than, say, 70% on the first attempt in reading zone, that's generally considered pretty successful with your students. second attempt, we've gone up now to 96%. So this student is doing pretty well in terms of his percentage scores. So we can see down overview, time spent for each segment. We know that less than about 100 minutes or so is on the faster side. So we're moving fairly quickly. We're showing pretty high scores. And again, we can go through each zone and we'll get scores and data in a little bit more detail for each particular zone. We can see word and spelling, number of fluent words. And again, spelling with the assessment. If we miss words on the assessment, we are going to study those words and eventually we'll have to show mastery, and that's what that's showing right there. And they will work on quite a few spelling words. We can see from this student, 49, 75, 82 different words. Those fluent words are from both your spelling assessment and then words that they may have missed, and then showed mastery a little bit later on the spelling challenge. For writing, we're going to look at how to score those writing and those success recordings here shortly. But if there's a writing passage or a success recording, a fluency recording, to have the data populate on your report, we're going to have to go in and score those. But we're going to look at that here very briefly. So I'd like to share a few more resources to support students in the application. And again, reading zone, the spelling zone tend to be some of those challenge areas. But there are some resources to help. So we shared out that handout earlier, the PLG pages, which will give you a good idea of just how each zone works for your students. And you'll see those screenshots, you'll see exactly how it works. So if you need to help kind of troubleshoot and work through each one of those, you can certainly do that. There's some other resources that I'd like to point out as well. So if we are in Teacher Central, if we click the top left icon, if you're also looking at experiencing or kind of demonstrating different parts of the software for students, there's a student app demo. And if you click launch right there, that's going to bring up the simulator. Now, you can choose your stage, maybe B for middle school, choose a different segment, choose an instructional level, and then bring up any task from any zone. So if we want to bring up, say, reading zone, for example, and what that does is we can bring this up, we can show the different features, we can let them know about the read aloud support, the strategy, going back and revisiting their power words, that kind of thing. So just kind of teaching them a little bit about the features that are available to help them, the different supports in reading zone or any of the other zones if you found that to be a challenge. So we can always demonstrate how exactly the student application works. The other resource to support your students is found in your resources. So in the top right, in the resources icon, what we're going to do is we're just going to search tips. If you search tips, you'll find a couple different documents that may be helpful, but the one that we're looking for is the student application tips for success. And this could really be a good resource. It gives strategies for each zone. So even just getting started, how to log in, how to log out, choose a different segment, and different strategies, maybe with the recording or other different challenge areas in the program as well. If we focus on the spelling, again, certain strategies for your students to be aware of, really kind of emphasizing that spelling assessment, because if they miss words, they're going to become their study words. And eventually they will have to show mastery on those words. Capitalization, apostrophes all count. So little tips, things to point out for your students to be aware of. If we back up to HMH Teacher Central, and we're going to click the top left icon one more time, there's also some instructional videos which could be helpful in your help center here as well. So if we launch that help center, that's going to open up a new window. And on that first initial screen, if we just go down a little bit, there's some tutorial videos, software tips, getting started, the different zones, so we can demonstrate those to your students. And as they become familiar, excuse me, as they become familiar with how it works, and how to use the different features and strategies in the software, the more likely that they'll be successful. If you're also giving some feedback and some performance and on their performance and conferencing as well, we're more likely to get the best out of our students. And the next part of the training, we're going to talk about some of those practical resources to conference and give some feedback as well. That is a pretty good overview of the application data, but we're not quite done yet because we still have some other areas we can talk about. And so what I'd like to do, we've looked at some resources, some different strategies to support your students in the application. There is some other data that we're going to get from the application. And if we go back to our data dashboard and we look at our diagnostic skills report, the diagnostic skills report is going to be only your reading skills and strategies from 2 areas in the program. It's going to pull data from reading zone. So again, part of why I do emphasize that this report can be some pretty actionable data, and we do want our students' best independent assessment in that reading zone. So diagnostic skills is going to give you the different skills performance from reading zone, but also workshop assessment. And you can view those. If you look at the top, we can look at combined, which means it's pulling data from both the application and the workshop assessment, or we can choose one or the other. If we want to look at only data from, say, reading zone student app, we can certainly do that. We have a skill explorer here. So if there's a student we've noticed is maybe struggling a little bit with the comprehension skills in the application, we can click on that student and we can look at overall strategies and even individual skills. And all of these skills here will have some supplemental resources to give some additional practice. So we can click through each student, we can look at the strategies and the skills, but if we scroll down a little bit and we'll take one area where we have a little bit more data, let's look at our combined key ideas and details. We'll have a little bit more information. So on the left, the strategy score column, and you can see I can click each one of these and kind of resort, which could be helpful to identify, again, students who might be struggling a little bit in a particular skill or strategy. So the strategy score encompasses basically all of the skills. So this score includes central idea, detail, summarize, evidence, main idea, and inference. So overall strategy score. But then if you want to look at each skill, we can see that performance data here as well. And again, could be helpful information to look at regrouping and pulling, say, reteach lessons if we sort by, say, summarize, and maybe Sean, Theo, and Tiffany need a little bit more support on that skill. Whereas other students, maybe Luis, we can work on, say, inferencing. So the strategy score will encompass all of those areas. And you also may notice too, like for this, in this example, Sean, we have 10 questions. And if we were to add these up, it equals 12. But we have a strategy score 4 out of 10. And that's because some questions might be tagged to multiple skills. We might have a question that is tagged to both summarize and say, and inference, which is why we might have a little bit more, we might not have an equal number of questions in each skill as the strategy. So this data is really intended to support informing your reteach groups or additional practice, targeted skills instruction for your students. And we could take any one of these areas. If we've identified a need in inferences, we could just go up to our Teacher Central resources. We could search for that skill inference, and we'll find some targeted lessons. Your resources for differentiated instruction, or your RDI, cover comprehension, language, writing, a whole series of supplemental resources, which we could bring up and say, download in different Lexile passages. So you could search for the skill, or you can just click on your resources, view all resources. We could navigate now to the left filter bar. Maybe we're searching for different lessons. So we'll click off lessons, skills, say reading comprehension, and we can get even more specific too. And then once we apply those filters, we can pull, again, some targeted resources. So the application will give us that really good continuous assessment data to look at possibly regrouping or targeting some of those skills based on that reading zone performance. All right, so the last area of assessment that I'd like to talk about in the student application comes from the writing and the fluency recordings. To access those software submissions for your Read 180 students, we're going to click to the top where it says Teacher Tools. And we're going to look at the assignment board. So what we're going to do is we're going to launch that tool. In your assignment board, there's a few functions that you'll find here. Assignment board is where you can assign your workshop assessments. And those are accessed from this plus assessment icon right here. Anything your students send to you will also be found here as well. So if they do quick writes in the independent reading bookshelf, if they're doing software submissions, the writing or the recording, we can access those from the assignment board. So I do have one example from a student. It's actually been archived, so it's already been scored. If you haven't graded it, it'll show up in your ungraded right here. And then all you have to do is just click that student's name. And you should see all of the submissions from the student. So you might see writing zone, you might see fluency check. And what we're going to do is we're going to look in the archive because we have a fluency check. That's going to be a recording, a final recording from that success zone. As a reminder, they do a lot of recording along the way throughout those segments. will have access to 1. And once we click that fluency check, we can see the exact passage that that student has read. We can play that, so we can bring up their actual recording and actually hear that. And so based on how long they took to read that passage, the program is automatically going to count correct words per minute. So that's going to make that calculation based on the length of the passage and how long it took them to read it. Now, what you can also do is, this one's already been scored, but you can highlight any miscued word. Say they mispronounced roster or another word in the passage. There'll be a little highlighter. You can just highlight that, and that's going to change the correct words per minute. So we can use this to do a fluency assessment with your students as well. And we'll also have an embedded rubric on the right-hand side here. So the students, one feature in the software is when they do those recordings, they're going to have to rate themselves. So we're starting to get them thinking about their accuracy, expression, and phrasing. And we can see this student gave himself little smiley faces. So they're thinking about those different aspects of what it means to read fluently. But if you want to, one of those other areas, one of those other practices in the program is, if we bring up these recordings, we can even do a little bit of conferencing with our students. So we could bring this up, we could play this with the student. If we have a conference day or a little bit more time to work individually, we can play those recordings, we can bring up the rubric, and we can really talk through these different points. And what does it mean to have proficient expression? Talk a little bit about intonation or phrasing and pausing. So we can do that conference, or we can score this too for expression, accuracy. And if we're looking at proficient fluency, we're really looking at about 160 words correct per minute, or phrasing as well. So again, if it's an area of need for your students, if we want to work on that fluency and expression with our students, we can use those rubrics, and we can do a little bit of conferencing, and also kind of holding them accountable for their progress in the software as well. If you score these and write comments down, then once you grade this, you can actually send this back to your students, and they're going to be able to access your feedback on HMH Student Central in their portfolio tab. We'll talk about that a little bit more here, because the next part of the training, we're going to bring this all together. We're going to talk about giving students feedback, goal setting, and tracking a little bit of progress. So we will come back to that. Before we do, let's kind of pause for another moment and just give some think time right here. So if you want to, pause the recording, take a moment to review your students' progress, go through that student application report, or maybe that diagnostic skills report that we looked at. Which students are showing maybe faster or slower rates of completion? Are we completing those segments? Are we tracking time in the program? If we're looking at those performance scores, which students are you finding that might be struggling in a specific zone or a specific skill? Any potential challenge areas that we're identifying. Based on that, what strategies can you use to support the students? What resources might you want to check into? Is there a particular zone we want to talk about, maybe demonstrate or check in, or maybe set a goal with our students that might need that support? So go ahead, take a quick minute. The last part of the training, we'll talk a little bit more about conferencing, feedback, and some practical resources to track progress. Okay, so this last part of the training, we'll kind of bring this all together and talk a little bit more about conferencing, setting goals, and just celebrating success, and really some guiding questions to help you think as you come up with a plan here. And again, we'll have some practical resources here as well. But when we're looking at setting student goals, especially when we look at those independent rotations, we really want to be thinking about what are students accomplishing? What are those behaviors that we're wanting them to exhibit? And what's the timeline? What's the when are we wanting them to achieve these goals? And really giving them some concrete, actionable goals to work towards, and potentially having those posted in classroom as well. As we're doing the rotations and as they're independent, we're wanting them to be successful while they're independent. So we want to have really clear goals, procedures, and outcomes, and then really explicitly teach or maybe even model those behaviors in order to achieve those specific goals. Are there some milestones that we want to set for our students? So again, especially using some of that data that we have in the independent reading report or in the student application report. What are those long-term goals? What are those short-term goals? Do we have a number of books we want our students to be reading? Maybe a number of points or words read throughout the quarter or the semester, number of segments in this 6-week time frame. And again, once we've identified those goals, what are those action steps that they're going to need to really achieve those specific goals? But also something to keep in mind too, how are we going to celebrate success? And, you know, as we have students coming in, we might have some students who are reluctant learners who might not be quite as motivated as some other students. How are we going to create that culture of success in the classroom? We see it a lot of times. Teachers really get creative when it comes to those types of areas. So maybe we have a success zone celebration, right? Because getting through a segment and getting through that success zone is a big accomplishment for some students. Maybe for some students who never read a full book before, that's a huge reason to celebrate. So something to keep in mind, again, having those goals, but then how are we really celebrating that success, especially for our students who might need a little bit more assistance with that motivation? When we're thinking about giving feedback, of course, making it consistent, ongoing, actionable, specific, and timely. We have some resources to help support the conferencing. Now that we've really reviewed that student application report and we have a little bit more information, we can identify some of those challenge areas. We can give students that feedback, have them reflect, and then come up with some strategies to support them as well. But especially with the independent rotations, making it consistent for them so they know that we're looking at the data, we're using those scores. They'll get a little bit of feedback on their performance in the application along the way, but they're not going to have nearly the same amount of data or scores that you'll have available in your student application report. So a couple more guiding questions. When and how often are we going to be providing those feedback opportunities for students, setting aside potentially a regular conferencing day where we can pull in students for a few minutes, bring up the reports, maybe bring up the recordings? Are we going to provide written, oral, or maybe visual feedback? Are we going to provide feedback on an individual, small group, or maybe a whole class level? And then will you support students to provide feedback to each other, potentially? We have a quick video here, and this shows an area that one teacher kind of got creative as well in terms of just celebrating success in the classroom.
My name is Jackie Ayer, and I teach Read 180 to 6th and 7th grade students. Grab your materials and head to your next rotation. Go ahead. One of my big goals was showing them how important reading is to them as an individual and to their academic careers. So I decorated the door so each student had a half sheet of paper and they had to put the career they wanted to be and then how reading was going to help them get to that career. I had, one who wants to be a professional YouTuber, and he's like, I don't need to read for that. I just need to watch videos. And I was like, well, what does a professional YouTuber do? Well, they need to reply to comments. They need to read the comments. They need to leave comments for other people. So even the things that seemed far off for them as to how reading's tied into it, we were able to find these connections.
I chose a professional baseball player because you have to go to college, and then you can get picked from college. You can go all the way up to the majors. So you need reading to pass college in school so you can get up there.
I wanted to be a business owner when I grow up, and it requires reading because you need to know how much money employees have to get. You have to read so much about the place you're either going to rent or buy, and there's a lot of different reading you have to do.
I also put a sign that through this door is the future and reading will help get you there, so that they know every day when they come in, they really need to try their best. They really need to focus on their reading because their long-term goal is waiting for them at the end.
Okay, so a couple things to think about, and of course, really just making it relevant for the students. There's so much choice in the program for the independent reading, the application, because we do want to encourage students to find things that are relevant and meaningful for them, which can certainly help with that motivation in class as well. So I'd like to look at a couple more practical resources in the program. And on Student Central, when your students get logged in, there's a couple of features to support their tracking their own progress. So we mentioned My Portfolio earlier. In My Portfolio, if they've done the recordings or the writings in the software and you've scored them, they can bring those up, they can see the comments, they can review that work, and they can get that feedback from you right through the software. If we navigate over to My Progress tab, this will show student completion in the zones as well. So in my demo account, we're not seeing this populate, but you can see what those data points will look like. So it'll show them how many questions they have remaining and how many they've answered in each zone. So they can kind of check that progress maybe prior to entering the student software. They can get some progress on some other data points as well. So their Lexile, one of those kind of best practices in the program is really teaching the students a little bit about the Lexile, maybe setting a goal. Everything in the program comes back to that Lexile. So it's really helpful if students know what that is, they know how to use it. Have they completed segments? Have they mastered words? And then sessions and minutes as well. So having a goal in all of those areas is always excellent. Students aren't necessarily going to know what a segment is unless we kind of fill in the blanks and give them a little bit of that guidance and maybe set that goal for them as well. So not a bad practice for them too, to check their progress maybe prior to logging into the student application and maybe tracking some of that. In your Teacher Central account, if we navigate back over, what I'd like to do is just point out a few other resources which could be helpful for providing some additional accountability or feedback on students' progress in the program. So in your resources, there are quite a lot of tracking logs for independent reading, for the software, for other areas of the program. And we'll just kind of point out a few of these. So what we're going to do, we're going to search for daily log. And we talked a lot about the student application today. If we're looking at additional self-monitoring or maybe additional accountability to provide that support for students in order to reach these goals, this could be a good resource. If you search daily log, you'll find this. And if we need to do kind of a quick check every day, essentially for students, all we need to do is just kind of check off the activity that we did in each zone. And then maybe if they're rotating to you in small group, we can just kind of check through that real quick, just to ensure that they're being active and working towards their goals in the software. So the daily log is a good one. There is a segment log, so we'll just search segment. This one you should also find in the back of the real book, but it's printable as well. And again, as they're working through the software, they can track different segments that they've completed, maybe do a quick reflection afterwards as well. Could be something else that we check off just to make sure if we've set a goal for number of segments or a deadline potentially for segment completion. Segment log. We can also search conference. Conference gives you a couple different options for conferencing logs. There's logs for System 44 as well if you're teaching that program. But let's check out the Read 180 student conference log. And if we download this, what's good about this is it gives you all of the major data points that we talked about. And reading inventory, it tells you the data, but it tells you the report as well. So after each test, we can track our score. We can have a goal. We can set a goal, and you can even get expected growth for your Lexiles as well. We can give some feedback to the workshop assessment. On the workshop assessment, independent reading, we'll have all those real major data points, student application, segments, sessions, session per segment, like we talked about. And we can identify those goals along the way. If we're looking at the data and we're giving that feedback to students, we're definitely gonna have a much better understanding about areas where they might be struggling, and we can get that reflection. We can set those goals with those students. So you'll find this by searching conference. And the last one we'll look at is independent reading. If you search reading log, there's a daily reading log, but there's also an independent reading log that they can use to track completion of each text that they finish as well. So this one, they can log that text, when did they finish, and then just do a quick recommendation and rating for that text as well. Always something we highly recommend having your students conference, track that progress along the way. So hopefully we can get a little bit more buy-in with your students. And there's a lot of resources to really support that. Let's pause one more time. So take a minute thinking through some of those big data points that we've talked about, the reports that we've analyzed. What are some goals that you want to set for your students? How are you going to give them progress moving forward? When are we going to build in some of that conferencing? What resources, what self-monitoring resources, conferencing resources do you plan to use? And then how are we going to celebrate success when we're meeting those goals as a class, as a group, or for individual students? What can we really do to help celebrate in class? So go ahead, take another minute. We'll wrap it up here in just a minute. To recap our training here for today, we started out by introducing all of the assessment options in each rotation. We looked at major assessments to monitor overall progress, but then also data in each rotation, application, independent reading, and whole and small group. We looked at some sample student application data. We talked about major program goals for performance, student application completion. We talked about placement and leveling in Read 180 Universal and some criteria for success. We talked a little bit about common challenges, specific zones, reading zone, fluency zone, gave some documents and some strategies to help facilitate your student success. We also looked at even analyzing that student application data for targeted instruction of reading skills, diagnostic reading skills report. Then we looked a little bit at some practical resources, strategies to conference, set goals, and provide some accountability in the student application to make sure our students are progressing. That was our agenda here for today. Thank you all again for listening. My name is Tim Zakaria, and have a great rest of your day.